Good afternoon, scholars.
Good afternoon, Miss Miles.
We're going to continue our lesson today on the civil rights movement. And yesterday we were talking about the Montgomery bus boycott and how this movement and the civil rights movement was an effective means of a nonviolent protest as well as an economic boycott. And these are going to be important learning objectives that are going to be reflected on the end of course tests that you're going to see at the end of the year. So these things we really want to focus on this week. And so make sure while you're thinking about these topics we talk about today, how they connect to the bigger picture. So what I'm going to really discuss right now is the Woolsworth lunch counter sit-in. And the Woolsworth lunch counter sit-in took place in the early 1960s. And at the beginning of the year, Woolsworth was a department store in Greensboro, North Carolina, where you know that several other movements took place in the civil rights movement. And at Woolsworth, there was several areas of the department store that were accessible to African Americans, but the lunch counter was not one of them. Only white customers could be served at the lunch counter. And several students from nearby universities decided that this wasn't something that they thought was right. So within the context of the civil rights movement, they decided to integrate the lunch counter. And the result of this was a sit-in. The method of the sit-in is something that we haven't talked about yet, but it's similar to the concept of Rosa Parks using in the Montgomery boycott, where she chose to sit on the bus and refuse to give up her seat. In a sit-in, the students would come in and sit down at the lunch counter and refuse to give up their seat at the lunch counter to white customers. So you can see how there's similarities in these two situations. And then with the sit-in, there was an end goal that the students had in mind, which is to integrate the lunch counter. And how they did this, and their actual result, we'll talk about it a little bit. But first I want to give you all a chance in groups to explore this concept a little further. So if you're going to refer to your handout that you got at the beginning of class, and go ahead and talk through the first three questions. The first one being, how do you think media played a role in making the sit-in a success? Question number 2, who do you think participated in the sit-in? And question number 3, how do you think the sit-in impacted Woolsworth's department store? So if you'll go ahead and discuss these in your groups, I'll give you about 2 minutes, and then we'll come back together and you'll share your answers with the class.
How do you think media played a role?
Well, it showed a wider range of people what was going on. I remember seeing this one picture of a black student sitting at the counter, and someone's dumping mustard or ketchup on their head. So, and just seeing that, I think, spread around would increase awareness of what was going on.
I think it made people pay more attention. You know, if it just happened in this one department store that was localized in this one town, that would affect just that one town. But when you bring in the media and let the entire state, the entire country know what was happening, and those crazy events like that were happening, it just made people pay attention.
Who do you think participated in the sit-in?
I think young folks.
Well, Ms. Miles said something about students, so I think that's right.
Probably black and white students.
What do you think the sit-in impacted you?
I'm not sure. Y'all have about 3 more seconds to discuss.
Well, there's obviously more traffic and more organizability, but I don't know.
Well, it definitely had an economic impact. They weren't making as much money that day, and people were paying much more attention to that store and how they were going to respond to such in that time of PR crisis. I think it made them pay attention to the movement and what was happening, and it's easy to ignore it. They had made spaces for blacks in their store, but it made them pay attention to the areas where they hadn't given it yet.
Are y'all ready to share your answers with the class?
Yes, Ms. Miles.
Excellent. All right, and we'll go ahead and start with Kelsey and Leslie's group. Do you want to go ahead and give your answers to number 1?
For number 1, we said that the media really showed the rest of the nation what was going on, and it made it a more widespread issue than just a localized issue.
Great. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I know Kelsey mentioned that it really brought more awareness to the concept and what was happening, and that's really something that at the time really was a big issue. By the second day of the sit-in, newspaper reporters and videographers had arrived on the scene, and within a week, the idea of the sit-in has spread not only to other college towns in North Carolina, such as Winston-Salem and Raleigh, but also within the next several months, it spread to all the southern states, or multiple southern states. So this really was a big, media coverage was really important in increasing awareness, as y'all said. So great job. What y'all have for number 2?
I think that young folks, you mentioned college students, but both black and white students, this wasn't just an isolated African American attempt to integrate the store, it was on both parts.
Yeah, great job. Specifically, there were white female students who came from the Women's College of the University of North Carolina. So that was specifically another group that came to help integrate. And then as the next couple weeks and months progressed, there were other civil rights organizations that would travel to participate in the sit-in, as well as community members, specifically church organizations that would come and participate as well. But definitely, you're very key in stating that it was both a white and a black college student movement. Great job. What y'all have for number 3?
Sorry. That there's definitely an economic impact on Woolworths. And they were going through, or they had to go through a PR crisis after that too. So paying people to handle that, and then not making money at the lunch counter, and then I guess the bad PR also would discourage people from wanting to go there too.
Yeah, no, definitely both of those played a big role. Specifically, Woolworth's overall sales, not just the lunch counter, but the department store as well, dropped by 1/3, which forced them to change their policies. And from the beginning, the arrest of protesters really sort of outraged the public to see both whites and blacks being arrested for participating. So that was a really big PR situation that you were seeing these young college students in the news being arrested for participating in just a non-violent protest. So the result of the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins was within several months, on July 25th, 1960, the 4 freshmen who started the sit-in originally were served at the lunch counters. This was the beginning of the integrated Woolworth lunch counter. So as you can see, it took from the beginning of the year 1960 to about the middle of the year, but eventually a change was made, and this continues to be a change that we would see in lunch counters across the South. Okay, if I was going to do this lesson as a longer lesson, what I would do differently would be to bring in more of textual references, specifically historical newspaper articles. There are many written at the time with different biases. So there's actually one interesting female reporter who really wrote for a Greensboro newspaper who wrote really sort of out of character at the time as other white newspapers would have seen it. And she had some really interesting things to say. I think it's also important to look at first-hand accounts as to what observers saw when they were looking at this. So those are other texts I'd want to draw in. I think it's really important, I did a little bit of it at the beginning, but contextualizing how the lesson fits into the bigger civil rights movement as far as framing it within the concept of nonviolent protest and the time frame where this fell within the other protests that took place that really sort of stand out amongst the other civil rights movement. And I had 2 great student participants today, but if I had a whole class, I would definitely want to break students up into groups, still to discuss, but also make sure that the entire class is engaged in giving responses, such as giving one group question 1 and another group question 2. That way they can really focus more time on specific questions and really become an expert in that field. And so when they're presenting the information to the class, they're not just presenting it to myself, but also their peers are learning from them as well. So if I was going to expand this into a longer lesson, those are the things I would focus on. So thank you for your time.